All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations based on the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm in the web forms or forms section. We're doing your first form. I did want to mention before we go any further that what I forgot to put on the form last time was a field set, which is that box that's around the entire form. So that's the beginning and that's the end. And it had a title on it that's called contact. So that's the legend attribute. So putting that there changed my form so it now looks like this, which I think is the way that they wanted it to look. Okay, so let's jump back in. We're going to build this thing. So let's have a go at creating the HTML for our form. Use the following elements. Now, I think I did create let me just close this. No, I'll leave it open. It won't really matter one way or the other. There was my first form. So let's create a folder called, in fact, let's call it forms instead of form. And we'll grab that, my first folder, and we'll throw that in there. All right. Now, the other stuff that we're going to put in there, it says we want we want to make a copy of a simple HTML template, which, as you can see, has virtually nothing in it. And that's fine. That's what we'll start with. And we will save this right away to our forms folder, and we will call that index.html. Why I keep doing that, I don't know. There we go. All right, so right now, if I brought that up, it's sure not going to do anything. The only thing that it really has is a title on it that says my test page. And this is my page. Let me move. There we go. It's 300%, but that's plenty big. All right. Okay, all forms start with a form element like this. Now, we've talked a little about this, but let's talk about it in more depth and breadth of coverage. This is the form tag. These are attributes to the form tag. They are not mandatory, but normally both are added. The action is what you want to have happen. It's the page that you want to go to or the URL that you want to go to when you submit the form. So typically a form has a submit button on it. The method that's in here is normally get or post. And we'll look at this more as we go through here. But get typically is used if you are accessing information. Post is typically used if you are submitting information. All right. And again, I'm being very general, very generic in that, but just so you know. All right. So as it says here, this element defines a form. It's a container like a section or a footer, but it's specifically for containing or creating forms. All right, so again, the action defines the URL where the form's collected data should be sent when it's submitted. The method defines the HTTP method that you want to use to send it. All right, usually get or post. So let's throw that form tag in here. And let's change this so we don't have a P tag. Let's put an H1 in here. And we'll just say in here, form example. And we'll enter H1 and put in an even extra line break tag. Now for the action, I'm not going to put in anything because that doesn't really make any sense. So when you have a beginning form tag as shown here, you need an ending form tag as well. Okay, so now let's start talking about what goes in between there. Our contact form is not complex. It contains 3 fields, each has a corresponding label. The input field for the name is a single line text field. Input for the email is also a single line text field, but it's of type email, whereas the name is of type text. And the message is type text area. So this looks very similar to what I had shown you before, except they put this in an unordered list. Totally fine to do that. Now, until they go in, because I'm going to run this in just a minute, but until they put this and add some CSS, it's going to look pretty terrible. All right, so let's come in here. All right, and let's save this. And we'll come back in here and refresh. There it is. Again, there's no CSS in here. The CSS will eventually be used to remove the dots there, to line this stuff up, and probably to make this message bigger and put some padding, margin, or whatever in here, etc. So the LI elements are there to conveniently structure our code and make styling easier, which they'll do later. For usability and accessibility, they've included a label for each one. And you'll notice that that label also has what's called the for attribute. What that means is if you click on the label, you go right into the box. Now that's not a big thing, but just so you know, that's one of the reasons for it. If you're going to use it, whatever you put in here must be the same as the ID for the form itself. You'll notice the labels really don't need an ID. We could put one in if we wanted to go and take certain labels and set them up in a certain way, or we could set a class for all labels, etc. But typically there's not a lot of styling that's going to be done separately for labels other than just using a label tag. On the other hand, notice ID is name, ID is, they said mail. They could have made it email. I don't know why they didn't. All right. Also notice not only do they have an ID tag, they have a name tag. Now, normally when I do this, I make my ID tag and my name tag the same. They chose not to do that for whatever reason. The only reason I bring up a name tag is the ID is used for programming on the client side. So for languages like JavaScript, the name is used for programming on the server side for languages like PHP, for example. All right. As it says, the benefit of using that for in there is it associates the label with the form control. Okay. It says you'll find further details of form labels later and how to structure a web form. All right. On the input element, the most important attribute is the type attribute. And again, type is text, type is email. There's other types, no pun intended, as well that we'll look at as we go on in here. Last but not least is we used a text area rather than an input tag. Again, the text area is designed for multi-line input. And as they mentioned, it's one of the oddities of HTML. Whereas the input tag does not have an end tag, the text area must have an end tag, just the way that they've set it up. All right. To give it a default value in here, you could have put in this. All right, I don't know why you would do that, but just to show you, again, there's another way of doing it that I'll show you in a minute. I'm not sure why they're doing this, but they are. So let's see. We'll put that one in there, and I'm going to comment out the one that we're actually using. The one that we're putting in right now, I'm going to remove it in just a second. All right. So they've got this text in there. By default, this element is filled with this text. And you can see it. Now, I would never, would never use that. Why? Because if I change this to placeholder instead, you'll see a subtle difference here. And you say it doesn't look any different. Well, you may or may not have noticed it's not black anymore, it's gray. When I take my mouse and as soon as I start to type, what was in there goes away. With what we had in there before, it didn't go away. All right, that text stayed there. You had to manually remove it. So I don't know why they put that example in there. All right, because I don't think it does any good, personally. All right, let me get rid of that. Make sure that we reset this back the way that it's supposed to look. And there we go. All right. Again, we could have put something in the text area. And again, I don't know why we would do that. If we were going to do that, we would again use a placeholder. All right. All right. Then lastly, we've got a button element. all right, to allow the user to send submit. Now, I'm going to go and actually put this in twice just to show you something. This is not yet in what we've been talking about, but I'm going to put it down here anyway. So I'm going to add this one. And then I'm going to immediately copy it and add it again. Why would I do that? Well, right now it doesn't look the way I want it to look. Because right now we've got two buttons in there that both say send your message. I don't want that. All right, we'll fix that in just a second. And also, let's see. Oh, they wanted LI, so I guess they do want it inside of the unordered list. All right, yeah. All right, so that's how they want it. Again, I'm not sure why, but that is the way they want it, so that's what we're going to do. Now, so you can see what that looks like. It looks terrible in my opinion. But what I wanted to show you, not to waste my time, not to waste yours, but I'm going to change this to reset. All right, and I'm going to say clear. One thing to notice in here right away, size of our button is based on what text is in there. Now you can change that with CSS. But what I want to show you is by setting that to reset, whatever I put in here, when I click send your message, it gives us that error, but when I click clear, it sets everything back to their default values. All right, now I'm going to remove that, but I wanted to show it to you because they had not yet mentioned it in here. So this should now be looking the way that they wanted it to look. All right. As it says, the button element accepts one of three values: submit, reset, or button. We use submit, and as it says, it sends the form's data to a web page, whatever you've defined in the action element. Well, we didn't define anything in there. In fact, if I do go in, this will give me an error, but I'm gonna say action here equals thank you .php. So right now the system expects that when I click the submit button, it's going to go out to a file called thankyou.php, which doesn't exist. All right, but I'm going to go and run this anyway like that. I'm going to put in a name. I'm going to put in a valid email. And I'll put in hello. Now I should get an error message. Your file could not be accessed. Notice it's trying to go to thankyou.php, which does not exist. All right. So let me remove that, but I just wanted to show you that's basically what happens with the submit button. All right. There's also reset, and I've shown you that button does nothing until you add some JavaScript to it. All right, it says you can also use the input element with a corresponding type to produce a button. And for example, input type equals submit. Well, that's the way that I did it, or didn't I? Oh, we said button here too. Button type equals submit. The main advantage of the button element is that the input element only allows plain text, whereas button allows, all right, more HTML content if you want to put that in. Okay. All right. It says if you don't think you got the code right, compare it with their first form example, which is there, but let's see it live. So that's theirs, and here is mine. Again, I changed that. I've got the H1. Let's set this back to 100%. In fact, let's make it 200. Looks like about the size they had it, I think. Nope. Looks good. So we've got that, and that's the one that's in the book, or our PDF, or whatever you want to call this. All right. Forms are notoriously tricky to style nicely. It is beyond the scope of this article to teach you form styling. So we will add a style tag in here, and let's just add this whole thing right here. We'll add our own style tags. So in the head section, of course, which is where our style tags would go, and there's our styling. Let me move this over so that it looks a little bit nicer. That'll work. Now, notice again, center the form onto the page. Well, that's what this does. All right, so it's saying that the width will be 500 pixels, but we want this centered on the page. We're adding 1M, which I think in here will be 16 pixels of padding, top, right, bottom, and left. We're putting a border around the form. All right, I use the field set, so we can now get rid of that. We've got a little bit of a radius right here, so it'll have a little bit of a rounded effect. Our unordered list that we're using, this says to remove the bullets, get rid of any padding or margin. We want a margin top of 1M for each of our elements, so that's going to do a little spacing in there. Our labels will display inline block with a width of 90 pixels and text align right, so that'll center them on the right, not center them, but right align them. Text area to make sure all text fields have the same font setting. By default, text areas have a monospace font, so everything will be sans serif. As it says, we'll have a uniform text field size. Match the borders. When the focus is on one of the fields, we will change the border color to black. We'll have the border color be black. The text areas, line everything up in there, give them a height. The buttons give some padding, etc. So I can come in here now. I guess I did remove it because I'm using their example. So pretty easy to figure out how this has changed. That's going to change this into this. All right, so you can see without much work how much nicer it looks. Now, the only thing I'll do that they didn't do is I'll come in here because they didn't have an H1 tag as I did. So I'm going to put in here my own styling for the H1 tag, and there's only the one, but I'll put text align, center. And hopefully that's going to align this. There you go. So not really much work to make this look pretty darn nice. All right, sending data to your web server. I'm on 18 minutes. Let's see, what do we have in here? Do we have a lot? No, let's finish it up. The last part, and perhaps the trickiest, is how to handle the form data on the server side. The form element defines where and how to send it based on the action and method attributes. We've named each control. The names are important for client and server side. They tell the browser to give each place. All right, that name attribute again is going to be used on the server side is what they're saying. All right, so that's what we have right now. This is only the beginning. It's time that we take a deeper look. So we've now finished the Your First form. Now we're going to come back in just a minute and talk about how to structure a web form. I'll be back with that one shortly.